Really?
Because I was so frightened. This was the facade of the coolness, the cold. And the whole bit that I think rather than a sex symbol, I was a sex zombie.
One actress was called a drunk when she was actually dying of something far worse. One vanished from public life after a single cruel night with photographers. One invented technology you still use today, yet the world only cared about her face. These were the goddesses of old Hollywood, women so stunning that audiences refused to accept what time, illness, and the studio system did to them. So the public made up a simpler story. They said these stars aged terribly.
Just live.
Just live?
Yes.
Simple as that?
Live with a lovely family, raising children. I don't mean live gloriously and make every day the 4th of July.
But the truth they buried is the part that will stay with you. What really happened to these women? Keep watching to find out. Bette Davis. By the time Bette Davis said, "What a dump!" at Lincoln Center in April 1989, she was already living with the effects of stroke damage and recurring cancer. That final image matters because it cuts straight through a common fantasy about old Hollywood women. People like to pretend these stars simply faded because they stopped caring about how they looked. Davis tells a different story. She was born Ruth Elizabeth Davis in Lowell, Massachusetts, on April 5, 1908. She chose acting after seeing Peg Entwistle on stage. From there, she fought her way into Warner Brothers and became one of the defining dramatic stars of the 1930s and 1940s. Her rise was built through Of Human Bondage in 1934, Dangerous in 1935, Jezebel in 1938, Dark Victory in 1939, and later, All About Eve in 1950. Her career stretched across about 60 years, brought her 10 Oscar nominations and 2 wins, and left audiences drawn to both her realism and the sharp, unsettling force she could summon whenever she wanted. The changes in her later appearance were not mysterious. They were deeply documented. In 1983, after filming the pilot for Hotel, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy. Soon after that, she suffered 4 strokes. By the end of her life, her body had been battered by illness, yet the public still watched her as though every visible sign of damage was part of the performance. When she died in Paris on October 6, 1989, she was returning from the San Sebastian Festival, where she had just been honored for a 60-year career. The phrase she wanted on her grave was already well known before her death. She did it the hard way. That line carried real weight. It fit a life shaped by studio fights, 4 marriages, a famous feud with Joan Crawford, and a final decade marked by surgery, partial paralysis, recurring cancer, and the public pain caused by her daughter B.D. Hyman's 1985 book, My Mother's Keeper. The book portrayed Davis as a bullying alcoholic, and it landed at a moment when she was already physically fragile. What makes Davis's case so striking is how clearly it shows the public treating illness as spectacle. Her late appearance was not some simple story of aging badly. It was the visible result of breast cancer, mastectomy, strokes, recurring cancer, and old age. Even then, she kept performing, kept smoking heavily, and kept holding the room. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth's so-called decline was one of the cruelest misunderstandings in old Hollywood. What many people read as alcoholism was, in fact, neurological illness. She was born Margarita Carmen Cancino on October 17, 1918. She trained as a dancer with her parents, signed with Columbia at 16, made her feature debut in 1935, and grew into one of the great screen goddesses of the 1940s through films such as You'll Never Get Rich, Gilda, and The Lady from Shanghai. Her private life drew nearly as much attention as her movies. Her marriages to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan kept her under constant public scrutiny. And the distance between the image of Gilda and the real woman behind it became central to her story. One line long attached to her captures that divide well. Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me. Repeated for years or not, it fits the larger truth of her life. Hayworth often pushed back against the fantasy built around her. The medical story is far clearer than the gossip that surrounded her. In the 1970s, she began showing troubling signs such as confusion and repeated questions. Her daughter, Yasmin Aga Khan, grew alarmed. In 1975, after Hayworth collapsed in Los Angeles, Yasmin gained conservatorship and moved her mother to New York. Even then, the real cause was still not recognized. It was not until 1981 that a neurologist finally diagnosed Alzheimer's disease. Before that diagnosis, people kept reading her symptoms as drinking. Her mood changes and memory loss were treated as moral failure instead of illness. That mistake says a great deal about the culture around her. In the 1970s, Alzheimer's was not widely understood, and Hayworth became one of the first celebrities whose diagnosis pushed the disease into public awareness. She died from it in 1987 at the age of 68. For this subject, Hayworth may be the clearest example of why the phrase "aged terribly" misses the truth. Her visible change was real, but it did not come from vanity, laziness, or some cartoon version of hard living. It came from dementia that went unrecognized for years. The hardest thing to look at was never her face. It was the culture's refusal to read illness without turning it into a moral judgment. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner spent much of her life being sold as pure, effortless beauty. By the end, she was living with the effects of a 1986 stroke, long-term respiratory illness, and the damage done by decades of smoking. That contrast shaped the way people looked at her, even when the facts were plain. She was born Ava Lavinia Gardner on December 24, 1922, in rural North Carolina. Hollywood found her after a Fifth Avenue studio portrait caught MGM's attention. At first, the studio did not know what to do with her. They even worked to soften her accent before building her image. After several years of small roles, The Killers in 1946 made her a star. From there came Showboat, Mogambo, The Barefoot Contessa, On the Beach, and The Night of the Iguana. Throughout her career, people confused the image with the woman herself. Gardner said as much in a 1982 interview when she explained that people mistook her for the sultry women she played on screen. Because she had been promoted as a siren and cast in so many sexy roles, people assumed that was her true self. She insisted they were wrong. Her later health record is unusually clear when stripped of gossip. In 1986, she suffered a stroke that left much of her left side paralyzed and badly weakened. Years of smoking caught up with her as well, and later in life she often needed an oxygen tank. She died in London on January 25, 1990, at 67, from pneumonia after several years of recurring illness. One detail also deserves to be stated plainly, because it corrects a favorite myth. She was not destitute at the end of her life. After leaving MGM's salaried system in 1958, she reportedly earned more and died in solid financial comfort. That matters because the public loves the story of the ruined beauty. In Gardner's case, the more truthful story is about illness, physical strain, and a woman whose public image remained trapped in a version of herself her body could no longer sustain. She had once been sold as predatory and glamorous. In old age, she was shy, weak, and medically dependent. Even then, the public kept circling back to her beauty first. The visible change in her later years had clear causes: stroke, smoking-related respiratory decline, and bronchopneumonia. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford seems to have chosen disappearance after photographers turned one public evening into something close to a preview of her obituary. She was born Lucille Lesueur in 1908 and was remade by MGM into Joan Crawford. She rose through flapper-era roles in the late 1920s and 1930s, then reinvented herself again with Mildred Pierce in 1945. She kept working into the 1960s, even as the roles grew smaller, and often leaned into camp or horror, ending with Trog in 1970. Even after her biggest years were over, she stayed visible. She answered fans, promoted Pepsi, and kept the machinery of her own legend moving. The story of her later physical decline comes in two connected parts. First, she spent the last 7 years of her life appearing only occasionally, and by early 1977, she was seriously ill with cancer, though she kept that private. Then there was the moment that changed everything in public. At the Rainbow Room in New York in 1974, photographers swarmed her, and the published images set off a round of comments about how much she had aged and how unwell she looked. According to later archival reporting, those reactions wounded her deeply. She is said to have responded, "Well, if this is how I look, then I won't be seen anymore." After that, she mostly withdrew into private settings with close friends. She died of a heart attack on May 10, 1977. The cancer that shadowed her final years helps explain why those photographs struck so hard. The public was not looking at simple aging. They were looking at a sick woman and turning her illness into commentary. That cruelty fed into a larger pattern. After her death, her will became public, and she excluded Christina and Christopher for reasons which are well known to them. Later, Mommy Dearest fixed Crawford in the public imagination as a grotesque figure. Once that image took hold, people read everything through it. Her face, her photos, her withdrawal, all of it became evidence for a story already written in advance. Some abuse claims in the literature around Crawford remain disputed, and serious disagreement continues among biographers. Still, two things can be said with confidence. Her final retreat from public view was triggered by harsh reactions to aging photographs, and the illness of her later years was real. Lana Turner. Lana Turner once testified that a violent boyfriend threatened to cut her face. That sentence alone explains a great deal about the kind of public life she endured. She was born Julia Jean Mildred Frances Turner on February 8, 1920. MGM first sold her as the studio-made sweater girl, but she proved she could do much more than that through films such as The Postman Always Rings Twice, The Bad and the Beautiful, and Peyton Place, which brought her an Oscar nomination. Even so, her private life, especially her marriages and the Johnny Stompanato case, often overshadowed her work. The Stompanato case is one of the best documented scandals of old Hollywood. At the April 11, 1958 inquest, Turner testified that Stompanato had earlier held a razor to her face and told her he would cut her just a little to give her a taste of it. On the night of April 4, 1958, she ended the relationship. She said he then threatened to kill her, her daughter, and her mother if she refused him. In the middle of that violent confrontation, her daughter Cheryl Crane stabbed him. 7 days later, a coroner's jury ruled the killing justifiable homicide. Yet, even then, the backlash settled on Turner herself. The following day, a newspaper editorial reduced the entire event to one line that blamed her rather than the violence around her. That reaction matters because it shows how quickly scandal swallowed the reality of abuse. Her later visible decline is also clearly documented. She died on June 29, 1995, after years of treatment for throat cancer. She was diagnosed in the spring of 1992, announced remission in early 1993, learned the cancer had returned in July 1994, and spent much of her final public appearance at the San Sebastian Festival in September 1994 in a wheelchair. There is no need to guess about what changed her appearance in later life. The record is direct. She was living through a smoking-linked illness that brought visible frailty to a woman whose image had long been built on polished glamour. Late in life, she said she wanted to be remembered as someone who helped preserve the glamour, beauty, and mystery of the movie industry. That line lands differently once you know how much pain stood behind it. Judy Garland. When Judy Garland died, the Westminster coroner did not record suicide. The finding was an incautious self-overdosage. Few phrases from old Hollywood feel more haunting than that one. Garland was born Frances Ethel Gumm on June 10, 1922. She was on stage as a toddler, entered MGM in 1935, and then became Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and painful careers in entertainment. She moved from child stardom into major adult work through Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, A Star is Born, television, and live performance, reaching a high point with Judy at Carnegie Hall. She appeared in more than 35 films, gave more than 1,100 concerts, won a Grammy for Judy at Carnegie Hall, and came to stand both as a miracle of talent and as a warning about what stardom could cost. The reasons her body and face changed over time are heavily documented. MGM executives shamed her appearance, forced strict diets on her, and, by her own account, gave her substances to get through long shoots and stay thin. By 1948, she suffered a nervous breakdown during The Pirate, attempted suicide, and entered psychiatric treatment. Her struggles grew from there. She used prescription drugs, took morphine pills obtained outside medical care, drank heavily, and later underwent electroconvulsive therapy. She was replaced in Annie Get Your Gun, relapsed while trying to lose weight for summer stock, and left MGM with her health already badly damaged. The damage did not stop when the studio years ended. In the 1960s, she faced divorce battles, allegations of physical abuse against Sidney Luft, and severe financial instability linked to mismanagement. By the middle of that decade, both the IRS and private creditors were pressing her for huge sums. Her death is among the most thoroughly documented endings on this list. The 1969 inquest found that she died from an accidental barbiturate overdose, described in that unforgettable phrase as an incautious self-overdosage. Later summaries add that there was no evidence of suicidal intent, and that the drugs were likely taken over time, rather than in one single act. Garland belongs at the center of this subject because the visible decline people remember cannot be separated from the system that shaped it. The studio controlled her body, medicated her, demanded performance after performance, and then allowed the wreckage to be read as personal weakness. What people later mocked as deterioration was, in large part, the cost of survival. Hedy Lamarr spent years trapped inside the idea that beauty was her only real story. In later life, that same public narrowed her again through shoplifting headlines, libel fights, and constant attention to her face. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in either 1913 or 1914, depending on the source. She first gained notoriety through ecstasy in the early 1930s, escaped a controlling marriage to arms dealer Fritz Mandl, and rebuilt herself in Hollywood through films such as Algiers, Boomtown, White Cargo, and Samson and Delilah. What makes her story especially striking is that she was never just a movie star. She also co-developed the frequency-hopping radio communication system that later became part of modern secure communications. The public record is firm on that point. Her patent was issued in 1942 under the name Hedy Kiesler Markey. Lamarr herself understood the trap of beauty with painful clarity. One of her most quoted lines says it all. any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid. That line lands even harder once you look at the rest of her life. While the public kept reducing her to glamour, she was also fighting to be seen as something more. Her later years drew harsh publicity. Shoplifting charges in 1966 and 1991 made headlines, though she was exonerated both times. She also fought back through the courts when books and newspapers turned her into a cheap spectacle. She sued over an autobiography she said was false and obscene. She also sued after being described in print as a pathetic recluse and old and ugly. That wording is useful to remember because it reveals exactly how the later life of a former beauty was framed. The press did not treat her as a woman aging in public. It treated her as a broken object. What cannot be stated with confidence is one specific medical cause for the visible changes in her face later in life. Reliable public reporting does not give a clear medical explanation beyond ordinary aging and long periods of seclusion. So, the careful version is the honest one. The cause remains unspecified in the stronger public record. What is clearly documented is the cruelty directed at her, her refusal to quietly accept it, and the absurd fact that a woman who helped shape modern communications kept being reduced to her looks. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake was working behind a bar under a false name before many people had fully processed that one of the 1940s most striking screen icons had already fallen into hard times. She was born Constance Frances Marie Ockelman in Brooklyn on November 14, 1922. She became a star through I Wanted Wings, Sullivan's Travels, This Gun for Hire, and The Blue Dahlia. Her peekaboo hairstyle, small frame, and cool screen presence turned her into a wartime pinup and a box office sensation. Then the image began to crack. Official summaries of her final years are blunt. After broken marriages and long struggles with alcoholism and mental illness, she died of acute hepatitis in Burlington, Vermont, on July 7, 1973. The later years became especially bleak because the public saw her not only in decline, but in ordinary working life. By the early 1960s, she was taking low-paying jobs, and in 1962, the New York Post found her living at Manhattan's Martha Washington Hotel and tending bar under the name Connie de Toth. That coverage turned her into a ready-made fallen star story. Lake pushed back. In later accounts, she insisted she was not the helpless ruin the newspapers preferred. Still, the alcoholism was real. Reports from those years describe evictions, drunkenness, a 1965 arrest for drunk and disorderly conduct, and one of her sharpest late lines from the publicity around her 1969 memoir, "I've earned this face." An earlier line from the memoir cuts even deeper. "Nothing really hurts you except people and old age deterioration of the cells." Her case matters because the public memory fused two stories together. One was medical and social. The other was tabloid theater. Reliable sources allow a strong claim that alcoholism played a major role in her visible decline. They do not support sweeping certainty about psychiatric diagnosis. Her mother reportedly said she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when young, but later accounts treat that as a claim rather than settled fact. So the careful version is best here too. The psychiatric side remains reported rather than fully established, while the broader decline is closely tied to chronic drinking, legal trouble, and social collapse. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor survived pneumonia, a tracheotomy, addiction treatment, brain surgery, chronic pain, and decades of public body shaming. Then, in the last act of her life, she turned all of that toward something larger than movie stardom. She was born in London on February 27, 1932, and grew up between Britain and Hollywood. She first became known as a child star in National Velvet, then grew into one of the great adult stars of her era through A Place in the Sun, Giant, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Butterfield 8, Cleopatra, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? She died on March 23, 2011, from congestive heart failure after a career of unusual scale and influence. Her later visible physical change was tracked constantly because she remained famous long after the studio era ended. The scandal cycle around her began early with the Burton affair during Cleopatra, continued through later marriages, and shifted in the 1980s and 1990s toward relentless commentary about her weight, pain, surgeries, and resilience. The public record now gives that story much more clearly than the tabloids ever did. She dealt with chronic back pain, multiple hip replacement surgeries, and the removal of a brain tumor described as the size of a golf ball. At the same time, she was trying to maintain recovery from prescription opioid addiction. She had also entered the Betty Ford Clinic in the 1980s. Long before that, in 1961, Cleopatra had to shut down when she developed pneumonia, so severe that she required a tracheotomy. Taylor belongs here because few women from old Hollywood were mocked more often for visible change. Yet when the record is laid out honestly, the story becomes much more serious. She was dealing with repeated medical crises, pain management, addiction recovery, and a powerful late life shift into activism. Her scars were not hidden. She carried them publicly. One line from her advocacy says more than any beauty commentary ever could. There is no gay agenda. It's a human agenda. Even her addiction story is now best understood not as moral collapse, but as hard-won recovery lived in public. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh kept drawing applause while tuberculosis and severe psychological suffering kept tearing through her private life. That tension never left her story. She was born Vivian Mary Hartley on November 5, 1913. She trained in Britain, broke through in theater and film during the 1930s, and became immortal through Gone with the Wind in 1939 and A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951, winning 2 Academy Awards. She often pointed out that beauty could interfere with serious judgment of her work, and her later screen roles in films such as The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone and Ship of Fools placed her in parts that now feel painfully close to her own life. The later years must be handled with care. Tuberculosis is firmly documented. Signs of it began to emerge in 1944, and the disease eventually hastened her death in 1967. Other parts of her suffering are described more aggressively by later biographers than they were by some contemporaries. Later writers and film historians often use the language of bipolar disorder. Laurence Olivier described her condition as manic depression in his memoir. Even so, this is not as cleanly documented in the way Rita Hayworth's Alzheimer's was. The careful way to state it is that later reference works often use that diagnosis, while the historical record clearly shows repeated breakdowns, periods of depression and mania, treatment, and institutional care. The public consequences were severe. She was unstable enough in 1953 to lose Elephant Walk. Still, she continued to work. She later won a Tony in 1963 and appeared in Ship of Fools in 1965. When tuberculosis returned again in 1967, she died at the age of 53. Leigh belongs at the end of this piece because she reveals the limits of the whole idea of aging badly. Her visible deterioration in the 1960s was tied to chronic physical illness and profound psychological suffering. One line often linked to her still works as a clean correction to gossip. "I'm not a film star. I am an actress." Whether that line is centered or not, the record still leads to the same place. The tragedy was never that Vivien Leigh grew older. The tragedy was how much easier it was for the culture to romanticize her collapse than to face the cost of what she kept doing while she was sick. Taken together, all 10 profiles point to the same truth. What old Hollywood often called bad aging was usually illness, exhaustion, addiction, or survival, written onto a face the public no longer wanted to see. Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were punished for being visibly older. Rita Hayworth was punished for showing signs of dementia before the public understood what it was seeing. Judy Garland and Veronica Lake were punished for addictions tied to both studio pressure and personal collapse. Hedy Lamarr and Elizabeth Taylor were punished because beauty mythology could not hold the full truth of their lives. Lana Turner was punished for surviving abuse inside a scandal the press found irresistible. Ava Gardner and Vivian Leigh were punished for looking like human bodies under strain, rather than fantasies kept perfectly sealed.